Do not adjust your set. This is the beginning of something.
I love it. I love
it. Television in the 1990s was a time of great change and bold experimentation that really pushed the envelope in what was deemed acceptable.
I thought, this is never going to happen. This is not going to happen. They can't do this to 7 people.
This gave the medium more agency than arguably ever before to really focus on the human condition, warts and all.
Why won't Uncle Jesse let us help him? It's just his way of dealing with the pain, you know, by keeping busy.
At the same time, it was also a period that emphasized continuity, providing an alternative escape to the idealized family values that people could always rely on. It was a time where everything was possible, but also wasn't.
Are you familiar with the so-called X-Files?
I believe they have to do with unexplained phenomena.
But how did this all come to be? What made television in the 90s the way that it's been remembered? What were the cultural forces that brought the things that you were once never supposed to see right into your living room? Today, we will be diving into the shared experience that both defined a young generation and helped create a whole new one. This is the one where we talk about television in the 1990s. Every man has a corner, a place where they retreat to their most authentic and individualized self in a world full of decadence and artificial vanity. But when a man's corner is empty, so is his confidence to love himself and his ability to manifest the material things he wants from the world. This is our friend Frederick Rumsen's corner, or lack thereof, the study room of his North Hollywood apartment, June 14th, 1968. And its lack of vitality is reflected in his ambition to live his own life.
I just don't think anybody gets me, Lori. I'm not fulfilled. No one's willing to be behind me here.
I'll be behind you.
You're my kid sister, you have to say that. I really ought to do something about it.
How are you going to make it?
I think I've got it.
He turned to gentle bands to find his self-sovereignty, a tool he has that is literally from out of this world. It is a ring called the Rebel, made from the titanium often found in spacecrafts. He chose it because he's not like everyone else, and he embraces that. For Freddie, it is the physical anchor for his journey to self-governance, to expanding his mind into an entirely different reality. Because when you're a rebel in status symbol land, you don't need to follow the rules. A rebel reads the room, takes it, and makes it his very own. He brings it to his corner. And this rejuvenated pursuit for his personal truth starts to spill into those around him, because it completely transforms his character. With gentle bands, Freddie is on an embryonic journey to self-actualization. With the link on the screen, you can start your journey today as well for just 25% off. Gentle bands, stop looking. You've already found it. To start off with a quick disclaimer, I will be discussing television in the 90s predominantly from the United States. This is a 10-year period after all, so unfortunately, I will not be able to cover everything, but I will do my sincere best. What really allowed for television to grow at this time, both in its capability and creativity, was the rapidly increasing popularity of cable. Television was no longer just this heavily surveillanced, centralized domain made up of 4 channels on public airwaves. Thanks to the coaxial cable, television was now made up of hundreds of channels on their own frequency and with their own set of rules. Now obviously, cable and the television industry as a whole had already long existed by the early 90s. And that is actually something that worked in its favor. With cable reaching mainstream status by the mid-1980s, the byproducts of it were coming into fruition by this point. You now had a well-established mass media empire with decades of marketing and technological experience and research under their belts. They understood their viewers more than ever before and had state-of-the-art AV equipment and this new thing called computer graphics that made the range of what you could pull off inside of a tiny screen almost limitless. Television was now comparable with the motion picture industry in Hollywood in terms of its capital and influence, and with cable opening the door to hundreds of more channels, that meant hundreds of more fledgling companies that had a detailed blueprint to work with to become successful. Now, what form of TV entertainment was the most low-hanging fruit and the easiest of cash grabs? Of course, the old reliable sitcom. Short for situational comedy, this was a consistently successful format that was as old as television itself. The best part was that they were super easy to make. They typically surrounded an all-American family, which meant hiring only a handful of main characters who were mostly in just one living room set. Filming in front of a live audience or using canned laughter allowed for jokes or situations to psychologically come off as funnier or more entertaining than they actually were. Since each episode typically centered around a whole new story with the same characters, continuity was not necessary. These were two things that allowed for sitcoms to get away with often pretty unsophisticated and lazy writing. Now, that's not to say these shows were bad, but they weren't exactly trying to be good. They were designed from the very beginning to be easy and quick to throw together. As long as these shows were effective at appealing to the audience's emotions at a superficial level, they did not require much thinking for someone to enjoy them. As long as it was the kind of show that someone could turn on and relax to after a hard day's work, a sitcom's job was done. Being that these shows aired during the primetime window, which statistically had the most viewers, if people liked them, they naturally made lots of more money through advertisers. Sitcoms had the advantage of being able to easily play it safe without having to worry about studios or even brands stepping in to change things. Additionally, creating an overly polished setting gave viewers a more palatable escape from their struggles of their personal lives and allowed them to enter the idealized world that they always wanted. Each decade had that kind of sitcom, and the 90s were no exception. One of the most successful examples of this kind was Full House. Although it started in 1987, its popularity and runtime was predominantly in the 90s. It was essentially the Leave It to Beaver of its time, a show about a wholesome, all-American family with adorable children who go on childhood adventures, and where the adults encounter conflicts that are rather saccharine. In fact, whenever these types of shows had episodes that did focus on real-world, even disturbing issues like drugs and alcohol, they were marketed as very special episodes. This was when things were really about to get serious. You wouldn't want to miss it. Even then, things would typically get resolved in about 22 minutes, with the characters learning valuable life lessons or adhering to family values. They were a shining example of that era's status quo. Once again, this is not a slamming of sitcoms as a form of entertainment. Not only are sitcom creators aware that this is a lowbrow format, they embrace it. That is the charm of sitcoms. They are unsophisticated, which in turn makes them very prolific and profitable. It is a big reason why it is a formula of television that remained rather rigid over several decades. Some things just never change, until they do. As successful as these sitcoms still were, there was still a growing sense of fatigue towards them. With the continuing rise of television media, there was now more opportunity for both network and cable channels to create sitcoms that sort of flipped this format on its head, or even pushed it to create something rather unconventional. This led to the rise of a very unusual show known as Seinfeld. Now, Seinfeld is often classified as the show about nothing.
What did you do today?
I got up and came to work.
There's a show. That's a show.
Now, this is not because the episodes didn't have any kind of plot, because they most certainly did, but rather, there was no overarching plot. There were no character arcs, no themes, no life lessons. It was really just a group of friends who act very selfish, don't learn anything from their mistakes, and overall just partake in unadulterated insanity. Episodes would instead just center around the very mundane, yet relatable, embarrassing moments and inconveniences of daily life. An entire episode could be about waiting for a table at a Chinese restaurant, trying to get soup from a renowned vendor who is also just a total jerk.
No soup for you!
or the entire crew having a contest for who can go the longest without pleasuring themselves.
I'm out.
Seinfeld was basically the antithesis of a Full House. It was cynical, self-absorbed, and did not sugarcoat anything, which is why people loved it. While Seinfeld did not invent this kind of humor, it certainly popularized it, especially in the multi-camera sitcom format. Similar deadpan, dry humor on network television dates as far back as the 70s, with the likes of John Belushi, Steve Martin, and Andy Kaufman on Saturday Night Live. Although this humor was a bit more avant-garde, whereas Seinfeld was more observational. It essentially did to the old sitcom format what Saturday Night Live did to comedic variety shows. It subverted audience expectations in the most unapologetic way. Seinfeld was also not just a show. It was an experience. The series finale was a huge historical moment in the 90s. So much so that, coincidentally, Frank Sinatra died the exact same night the show ended, and the ambulance that took him to the hospital did so in near record time because the roads were so empty due to everyone staying at home to watch the show's ending. While they may not have been as on the nose about it as Seinfeld was, many other 90s sitcoms also started changing up this long-established format to feel more real and fresher. More lighthearted and comedic shows like Everybody Loves Raymond also twisted this around, constantly reminding you how their adorable children were not going to be the center of the episode. Rather than just rehashing the well-put-together American family setup, why not, like Seinfeld, just create a show about a group of friends in their 20s and 30s who have no idea what they are doing with their life? Heck, you could just call it Friends. While it definitely follows that traditional sitcom format much more closely than Seinfeld does, it certainly turns it around by making it much more relatable and applicable to real life. These people have no idea what they are doing with their lives, and that's okay.
Pivot! Pivot! Shut up! Shut up! Shut up!
They relate to many of the struggles that you have. With some exceptions, of course. Not sure how many of them could afford such nice apartments in New York City with the jobs that they had. Even for the early 90s, New York City was insanely expensive, but I digress. It really played on the meta-ness of 90s sitcom formats, with even the episode names, such as the one with the blank. Like how many people talk about television in everyday life. It was the perfect show for people who wanted something new, but still enough of that familiarity to be more digestible. It was funny, full of heartbreak, and occasional introspection, even covering previously taboo topics such as LGBT culture.
I don't know, you just have a quality.
Right.
In fact, this is a very common theme that starts to pop up in the 90s with not just sitcoms, but 90s television as a whole. Shows that center around minority groups that previously had little to no representation. This was, of course, in large part due to cable television creating more fragmented target audiences, but also due to changing attitudes towards gay people throughout the 1980s. A very dark reason for this was the prevalence of the AIDS epidemic the decade prior. Due to unfortunate false claims that it was a gay disease, it brought a lot of attention towards gay individuals from the public eye. By the time the epidemic slowed down, a sizable portion of the public was now very aware how many gay people were just part of everyday, normal American life. You could even argue that much of the overly campy and flamboyant pop culture of the 80s helped make this integration smoother as well. Now, this is not to say that gay oppression was resolved at this point, because it absolutely wasn't, but a good chunk of Western pop culture was able to acknowledge it, at least with indifference. You now see TV shows with gay characters. Heck, even main characters.
I'm gay.
But of course, there were growing pains. On that 70s show, Eric's gay friend named Buddy was meant to be a recurring character, but was written off after one episode because of how much controversy it caused. It was popping up a lot more, but it wasn't comfortably integrated into Western society just yet. This was something that was only lightly dabbled in years prior, and was virtually unheard of generations before. You also had shows such as Roseanne that gave a comedic, yet much more real and grittier voice to working class Americans, once again turning around that pristine family life structure. This continuing boom of cable also gave a voice to another demographic, arguably one of the most popular sitcom formats at the time. You have the rise of black sitcoms. With network television, for the better part of 40 years, only having around 3 to 4 channels, they could really only make programming that focused on the majority demographic of American citizens, which was suburban white families. But as the civil rights movement gained huge momentum and public awareness, black representation in network television became more commonplace throughout the 70s and 80s. Shows such as Sanford & Son, The Jeffersons, and The Cosby Show proved to be incredibly successful. And now, with the launch of Fox, WB, and UPN, along with hundreds of cable channels to choose from, and the power of syndication, this was made even easier to work with. Diversity was no longer something television wanted to avoid, but rather saw it as something more commercially desirable. So you now have new shows surrounding black families, such as The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Fresh Prince was not only revolutionary in that it once again twisted the old sitcom structure around with very deadpan and meta comedy, it also challenged how black families were often portrayed on television. While older sitcoms like The Cosby Show and The Jeffersons helped to bring black representation to mainstream media, Fresh Prince pushed the conversation even further. As absolutely hilarious as the show was, it did not shy away from very serious issues either, such as drug abuse, family abandonment, and even racial prejudice and police brutality. It also bravely showed that black culture was not monolithic or defined entirely through its interactions with white America, like how it was often depicted in media before. Instead, it came in a variety of shapes and forms, which was highlighted in big contrast between Will's more hip-hop upbringing in West Philadelphia and the prestigious and preppy wealthy Banks family in Bel-Air. And one lived experience wasn't better or worse than the other.
You think I'm a sellout? Why? Because I live in a big house or I dress a certain way? Being black isn't what I'm trying to be, it's what I am. I'm running the same race and jumping the same hurdles you are, so why are you tripping me up?
You also had Family Matters. While definitely not as daring in its humor as Fresh Prince, it centered around a black middle-class family from Chicago, and Steve Urkel was just amazing. In my opinion, one of the funniest sitcom characters of all time.
Did I do that?
But I also have a very juvenile sense of humor, so. It is also a sort of callback to that Three Stooges slapstick kind of humor. And so black representation in media was gaining massive popularity. Not even just with sitcoms, but also with sketch comedy, with shows like In Living Color, which also brought previously unknown comedians like Jim Carrey to household fame. Which brings me to my next category of 90s television, live television. Or at least the type of show that was formatted to appear live. This includes variety shows and sketch comedy performed in front of a live audience, talk shows, and so on. You had The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, who replaced Johnny Carson, the original host since the show's start 30 years prior. There was also Late Night with Conan O'Brien, who aired after The Tonight Show, around midnight, hence the name Late Night. Conan replaced David Letterman, who moved over to CBS to do basically the same kind of show that he did over at NBC. These shows, as you probably know, provided humorous commentary on current events, had special celebrity interviews, funny skits, and much more. Conan is my personal favorite of this lineup, but I really enjoy Jay Leno's headlines, where he reads out typos and strange phrasings from real-life newspaper articles.
Look at that. In 2025, Montanans will be older.
These shows were so popular because, of course, they provided you all the current pop culture news you needed in a time before social media and when the internet was still very primitive. Not to mention, people were also heavily drawn to it because of the huge rivalry between Leno and Letterman, as Letterman was long assumed to be Carson's natural successor, and he felt that Leno had stolen it from him. sounds familiar. But these talk shows were typically targeting older individuals and often provided commentary that was more to their taste. For a more youth-driven talk show, you had Arsenio Hall. It was basically the MTV of talk shows, providing coverage on Gen X's top cultural trends and icons. It is also at this time where prominent talk shows decide to use their large platform to essentially reinvent themselves, to transform the medium into an introspective live commentary on daily life, the good and the bad. The most prominent example would be The Oprah Winfrey Show. Starting out as sort of tabloid-style material in the 80s, Oprah quickly shifted her show into more highbrow content, for lack of a better word, often covering very real subjects. Examples include her eye color experiment, where she segregated her audience based on eye color to really demonstrate the impact of racism and prejudice, and her special with Michael Jackson, which has since become the most watched interview in all of history. Michael Jackson also, at the time, had the most watched Super Bowl halftime show in history. He really was quite the pop cultural trailblazer. But of course, tabloid-style shows did still continue on, just in other shapes and forms from before. Because while some of these talk shows were undergoing a change towards authenticity and sophistication, that loudness never went away. If anything, it only got louder. And if there was any show that embodied this high-spirited entertainment, it was Jerry Springer. This show basically replaced what Oprah was doing back in the 80s. Family drama, crazy sensationalist stories, and gossip. It was the ultimate junk food TV experience. Jerry, Jerry, Jerry.
The world is mine! The world is mine!
And then there was the long-continued run of Saturday Night Live. Especially compared to its more experimental, character-driven comedy of the 80s, SNL was starting to enter a bit more of a physical, chaotic style of humor. SNL's shining star in this category would be Chris Farley. His very bold and confident stage persona was just hilarious and immediately made him the center of attention in virtually all the sketches that he did. Although Chris Farley was a little before my time, I watched him on reruns growing up and just loved him. I also really enjoyed his films with David Spade, Tommy Boy, and Black Sheep. Given that I was the generation after, I would say that the brilliant comedy of Chris Farley transcends just being something frozen in 90s culture. But it was also something that was just moved by the overall rebellious, loud undertone that the 90s had. Granted, I have no definitive research to back up these next claims, but I was talking with someone about this who argued that it was a sort of response to the more rigid, restrictive humor of the 60s and 70s that Gen X grew up on as children. Obviously with a couple exceptions. A good example of this would be John Waters. He released some bizarre and shocking movies in the 90s and was in large part inspired to make his kind of campy, subversive style of media as a way to rebel against the conformity of 1950s American suburban life. Granted, he is much older than Gen X, but I think they may share pretty similar sentiments. Of course, the 60s and 70s were an era of great rebellion and provocative media, but it took some time for mainstream media of the time, notably television, to catch up, which would have been the kind of stuff Gen X grew up on as young children. Another component is the rise of home video. Now that all kinds of media were reaching all kinds of people from countless numbers of cultural backgrounds, slapstick was essentially the universal language, the thing people can relate to and find hilarious without needing complex dialogue. You'll see just the kind of indirect influence home video had on other aspects of 90s television too, and we'll get into that later on. But SNL's influence was always strong since its start, and it continued to be just as strong by the time the 90s came around, adapting rather perfectly to its time. You start to see a lot of other media trying to emulate or even parody it, especially kids' entertainment. I would even argue that this was a huge foundation for a rapidly rising kids channel called Nickelodeon. Its cash cow for the better part of a decade, was a show called You Can't Do That on Television, which brought a lot of the things we recognize with that brand today, such as the iconic green slime. But by 1990, the show was on its way out. So it was time to reinvent this format to be more fitting of the times. As people in the 90s put it, it needed to be all that. In fact, let's call it All That. Created by a new children's producer named Dan Schneider, it was basically Saturday Night Live for kids, bringing many child actors to household name status, such as Kenan Thompson, Kel Mitchell, Amanda Bynes, Nick Cannon, and Lori Beth Denberg. Many of them also had their own spin-off shows, which continued this format. The channel got even more on the nose with it, with their programming block Saturday Night Nickelodeon, or SNICK for short, which also helped in bringing many other live-action shows to the channel's growing portfolio. But they also started working on another form of entertainment that would prove to be insanely successful: animation, which they called Nicktoons. Shows like Ren and Stimpy and Rocko's Modern Life once again carried this slapstick, high-energy style of comedy that was popular at the time, the sort of Looney Tunes kind of thing. These were also shows that were often deeply cynical, even for kids' entertainment. This style was then branched into other kids' channels, such as Cartoon Network, and to a lesser extent, even Disney Channel. This is something that you also see with a lot of adult animation, most notably The Simpsons. Initially appearing as a short on The Tracy Ullman Show, The Simpsons was a cultural phenomenon unlike any other. It was basically the Seinfeld of animation, in that it completely subverted people's expectations within the genre. In addition to the characters being unusually yellow, which was intended to grab the attention of channel surfers, the family was not ideal. It was dysfunctional.
Boy must die!
I love you, Dad!
Dirty trick.
The humor was not sanitized. It was often crude and unapologetic.
I am shocked and appalled.
And the writer's room was backed by incredible talent, such as Conan O'Brien. Arguably the most iconic episode of its time was Marge vs. the Monorail, which also included very notable guest appearances from Phil Hartman and Leonard Nimoy. Many considered it to be one of the best episodes of any show on television.
Once again.
But The Simpsons was just one example among dozens of animated shows that featured crude, dry, and deadpan humor that was also still energetic in nature. This would be taken even further later on in the decade with South Park, which showed that you basically no longer had any limit for what was allowed on television.
We told you they were real, Cartman. Sorry to hear about your ass. God damn it, they didn't do anything to my ass. It was just a dream.
But with the rise of home video creating a sort of monoculture for television, non-Western animation also starts gaining a lot of attention at this time. A form of Japanese animation known as anime. This was a very interesting format in that it brought a very unique and attention-grabbing animation style to the screen, which not only included this action-packed energy that we talked about, but also provided serialized storytelling that often really made you think. Even a lot of kid shows did this too, like Rugrats and Doug, which in addition to having funny moments, also had moments of looking inward and thoughts of childhood innocence. With all this rapidly advancing media technology, there was a sort of continued civic duty among many people to make the young children, an upcoming generation known as millennials, better understand themselves and the world that they lived in. They were the future after all. So naturally, a lot of children's entertainment is also educational. Imaginative and brightly animated shows like Magic School Bus highlighted that learning did not have to be boring, and that even school itself could be an exciting place to be. Shows like Captain Planet reminded kids that the world was their home, so they needed to take care of it and keep it healthy. This also branched out into many creative live-action shows that harbored that same desire to make learning fun. Turns out, kids are very impressionable, and you can do things like sell merchandise to them, so it becomes very easy to make shows that bank on that. But learning was for the adults too. The Discovery Channel and the History Channel were putting out what were essentially edutainment documentaries on a whole variety of subjects. Home video distribution even brought this into the classroom, with shows like Bill Nye the Science Guy, and the growing use of CGI allowed for barriers to be broken in how educational things could be easily visualized and therefore even more immersive for viewers who were learning. It was all about turning the boring into something interesting. As we see with both this and with things like Oprah's show, it is clear that more real and candid media is starting to pop up, often alongside this high energy. MTV was a great example of this, which brought bands like Nirvana, Green Day, and Smashing Pumpkins to global fame, and in turn made grunge and alternative rock a musical powerhouse. They in many ways perfectly embodied this rebellious spirit of Gen X. But then music television started experimenting with formats that were not just related to music, with their launch of a new show called The Real World, creating the modern blueprint for what we know as reality TV. The Real World was the show that gave viewers a real, in-depth, often unfiltered look at Gen X, which could hopefully provide some explanation for why they were the way that they were. But of course, MTV didn't abandon music entirely. They even launched Total Request Live, or TRL for short, which was essentially a modernized version of Dick Clark's American Bandstand, focusing on the music videos of the current hottest musical acts. The 90s also showed that television was no longer just parasocial, but also social. It was something that you could now be a part of and directly interact with. A huge novelty at the time, where interactive technologies such as the internet were still in their infancy. This was primarily done through game shows. Of course, these were not at all new in the 90s, but they definitely became more commonplace for a couple of reasons. The first one is obvious. More cable channels popping up meant more opportunities for game shows to be made. The most notable would be the Game Show Network, which launched in 1994. These shows were also very easy to put together, even compared to something like a sitcom. You didn't need a big group of writers or a bunch of talent, just a host and a very basic game premise. It was the guests who really did all the heavy lifting in making it entertaining. You also had the 1-900 number. These were initially used for more adult phone talk, but it also started to take on as a way for people to interact with game shows and even get a chance to win prizes by answering certain trivia questions or solving puzzles. This brought even further attention to long-established shows like Family Feud. The new show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, also used this phone approach with their phone a friend option given to contestants who needed help answering a certain question. This was something that was also parodied and even adapted entirely by kids' entertainment, such as in the previous decade with Nickelodeon's Double Dare. This was by far their most popular game show that they did. But the trend continued with Nickelodeon Guts, Legends of the Hidden Temple, and eventually their dedicated programming block known as Nick Gas. I mean, just look at all the flexible ways that television could be used. Of course, it didn't just stop there. What if you could also just reinvent the concept of a TV show? Instead of just individual plots that were summed up in 20 minutes, what if you made shows that were not only double that length, but were serialized and even embraced story continuity? Basically a soap opera, but much more sophisticated, much higher budget, and used state-of-the-art production technology, almost like a bunch of movies. You see the rise of the 45-minute episode. Once again, this format predates the 90s, but the 90s reinvented it. One of the first shows to really kickstart it off was Twin Peaks. Airing on ABC, this show once again redefined a genre by subverting people's expectations. It was quite meta in a lot of ways, often playing off of and even parodying the soap opera style of the time, turning the whole mystery whodunit genre into a surreal, dreamlike experience. The plot itself even acts as a sort of Trojan horse. Viewers getting into it for the first time think it's about finding out who killed Laura Palmer, the central figure of the story. But as they watched it, they soon realized it was so much more than that. Twin Peaks was not just something you watched. It was something that you experienced. This would no doubt have influence on other mystery shows, such as The X-Files, another cultural behemoth of its time that once again blended mystery with the surreal and the uncanny.
Do you believe in the existence of extraterrestrials?
What I find fantastic is any notion that there are answers beyond the realm of science. The answers are there. You just have to know where to look.
That's why they put the I in FBI.
This wasn't just limited to mystery, though. It was a very flexible genre for things like historical fantasy, period pieces, comedy, and drama. HBO would very quickly become a popular face of this format with The Sopranos, which aired later on in the decade and is often credited as kickstarting the second golden age of television. In fact, it is also at this time where you see a rise in teen dramas, such as Dawson's Creek, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and later on, Freaks and Geeks. This is no surprise, given all the things we just talked about and the kind of agency and voice that these types of shows gave to young people. And lastly, television in the 90s did something that it arguably would do for the very last time in a centralized environment. It provided a shared experience, not just within entertainment, but for those observing the world in real time. This is something that would really change in the 2000s, with the rise of a whole new internet made up of social media, where people were no longer getting their information from the same sources. Because it was the 90s that brought us the very first war to be broadcast live. Unlike Vietnam, which was pre-filmed and then aired later on. This real-time television experience is what really made a channel known as CNN a news powerhouse. You could say that the 90s was truly the last time where everyone could really witness the same thing at the same time. Like when the entire world watched the trial of O.J. Simpson unfold and the absolute roller coaster that it was. This was real life, not a movie, but it was certainly all playing out like one.
It is finally official. Murder is legal in the state of California.
Or the millions of Americans who tuned in to a national scandal that was rather minute in terms of real-world problems, but was certainly embarrassing and full of gossip, especially in what was often perceived as a very serious and professional institution.
Indeed, I did have a relationship with Miss Lewinsky that was not appropriate.
The world was not just in your living room. It was more detailed and current than it had ever been before. Whether you liked it or not, you were now a part of history. And going forward, things were truly never going to be the same ever again. If you would like to learn more about the 90s, I have included a playlist in my description, as well as a video about the 2000s right here. A special thanks to my Patreon supporters. Check out patreon.com/nationsquid for ad-free videos and exclusive content. You can also get ad-free videos on Spotify with Spotify Premium. A coffee is always appreciated too. Thank you for watching, everyone.